All right, the final speaker of our session is Dr. Damour. He's a staff research scientist at Google DeepMind. He joined Google as a research scientist in 2018. He has a PhD from Harvard in statistics, and he was also the Neyman visiting assistant professor here at Berkeley. His work focuses on improving the reliability, fairness, and robustness of machine learning, and he has gotten his hands dirty with data quite a lot in his life, including being the founding partner of Damyata, a data science consultancy with clients including Legendary Pictures, did Dune 2, the Philadelphia 76ers, as well as the Harvard School of Public Health. So let's everyone please welcome Dr. Damour.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Yeah, I think this talk might feel like something completely different. I'm going to sort of jump into some stuff that's more, I guess, machine learning oriented. And what I'll talk about here is that when I personally made a transition from being a statistician to going to a place where everybody thinks about neural networks all the time, and that's about it. Right, and so one thing that I noticed in sort of making this transition, right, was that predictability and computability are really in the DNA of machine learning and AI, right? These are the things that really hold the entire edifice together and that have really made those fields move forward. But at the same time, stability, and especially construct validity, and in particular, how we define success in the problems that we try to solve with machine learning and AI, that still remains a really core challenge. And so today I'll try to use an example of reward models for alignment in large language models as an example of how this sort of thing crops up. So I guess I already sort of gave my introduction. I always like to pay homage to Leo Breiman's two cultures, right? Thinking about how different people might approach problems. And I think one thing here is that we are very much in this talk in the sort of algorithmic culture where there was a discussion earlier about an explanation culture versus a prediction culture. And here, I think for the most part, the way that my colleagues think about problems is less about trying to figure out how the inner workings of something operate and more trying to mimic a natural process using something like neural networks in order to take an input X and map it to an output Y. And so if we think about how this is done in modern machine learning, right, usually what we'll do is we'll take a bunch of data, we'll call that our training population, and then we'll split it into a train and validation set that we'll use to actually train a model and tune its hyperparameters, right? And we'll sort of train a model using that training and validation data, and then we'll test it on some test data, right? But that test data comes from the same data distribution, right? Usually it's just something that's sort of randomly held out from the same data distribution. And in the machine learning world, they call these IID evaluations. Statisticians often sort of bristle at this terminology a little bit because you can also have dependent data that are called IID evaluations. But basically, this just means that we are evaluating on data that comes from the same distribution as the data that we use to train the model. Right. And this has really been the secret sauce for a lot of how machine learning has operated, right? We can sort of have this caricature of machine learning from this XKCD comic here, where modern machine learning is sort of just a pile of linear algebra that you're stirring around with a paddle till the outputs look good. But at the same time, right, there have been some amazing things that we've accomplished just by using this framework here, right? If you look at this framework, this is essentially a framework that is focused entirely on computability and predictability. All right, but one problem that often comes up is that when we take data when we take a model that has been trained in this way to be extremely predictable on a particular view of data from the world, and then we try to apply it in the world, there are a bunch of issues that can crop up, right? So we can find that models like this are not particularly robust in the sense that they start making predictions that don't quite match what we actually want them to be predicting once we move out into the real world and away from the data that we use to train the model, right? There might be issues that we see with fairness or whether people feel like they can actually take actions to change the decision that a model is making about them, or whether it appears that the model is using the right structure, right? And so there are a number of famous examples of this. For example, from 2018 to 2020 or so, there was a lot of work that was going on models that were used to predict the classes of objects that were showing up in different images in data sets like ImageNet. And then it was shown that if you just apply these sort of corruptions that don't necessarily bother people in terms of figuring out whether or not this is a bird showing up in this picture, but many machine learning models would start failing pretty miserably, and their accuracy numbers would just drop if you apply these kinds of corruptions. Right. Another example here was using natural language processing models to do toxicity detection. There was a model that was released to try to help content moderators, and one thing that they found as soon as that they released it was that there's a very high correlation between the use of identity terms in sentences and the toxicity score that the model was assigning to those sentences. Right. And then, more recently, we've seen some issues. For example, right, if somebody typed in "how many rocks shall I eat" to Google about a week ago, right, you would get an answer like this: that yes, this geologist at UC Berkeley says you should eat at least one small rock per day, right? And it turns out that this came from an Onion article that was reposted on a geology software company's website as well. And so it sort of showed up as having some credibility because these people have expertise in geology. And so the model ended up picking that up, right? But there are just so many different examples of machine learning models that behave very well under controlled testing. And when you sort of take them out into the world, they start making decisions for the wrong reasons. That becomes very apparent in terms of like mispredictions, right? And so really what this comes down to is that defining real world success metrics is very hard, right? And I would argue that as we have models that are made to be more and more general, where people can just decide at the moment that they're using them what they want the model to, like what task they want the model to solve, that this is only getting harder. And so one of the issues that I've focused on in the past is this idea that the way that we train these machine learning models is underspecified in the sense that there's a particular metric that we're often hill climbing on, but doing well on that metric doesn't necessarily define all of the behaviors that the model is going to have, right? And in fact, what you can do often is you can use the exact same pipeline, right, and just tweak small aspects of that pipeline that you would think are relatively innocuous. For example, the random seed that you use to initialize your optimization. And you can end up producing models that have substantially different real-world behaviors. And so this is something that I'll talk about in the context of a particular procedure that we use a lot in large language models called reinforcement learning with human feedback. This is a paper that I advised that my colleagues Jacob Eisenstein, Chirag Nagpal, Alec Agarwal, and Jonathan Barant were the main authors on. So for those of you who aren't familiar, when we're building these large language model systems like Gemini, there are sort of three main steps that you go through. The first one is pre-training, where you train a model to be able to sort of predict the next word in a corpus of text that is something like the scale of the internet, right? The next step is that instead of building a model that's more of like an autocomplete model, right? You'd like to turn it into a model that you can actually have some dialogue with. And so there's a supervised fine-tuning step where you sort of turn the model into more of like an interactive style model rather than an autocomplete one. The final step is what is often called alignment. This is really trying to fine-tune the behavior so that the model tends to make the right default decisions. All right, so ideally, if we were doing reinforcement learning with human feedback, right, what you would do is you would sort of provide a prompt to this model. It would provide a couple of responses, and you have a human rater who says, oh, I'd like response A better than response B, right? And then what you would do is you would then take that feedback, you just feed it right back into your generation policy, right? We call this a generation policy. This is just the model that's actually generating the text, right? And you try to sort of tweak the way that you're generating text over and over again using a human in the loop, right? So this is extremely expensive, even for an organization like Google. And so what is usually done in this context is that you take sort of one round of this, right? You take a bunch of prompts. They get passed into the LLM. It provides different responses. A human rater is going to say yes or no on this. This generates a data set. Then you use that data set to train a separate large language model to mimic what this human rater would have done, right? And then in that loop that I showed you earlier, you just drop the reward model in where the human would have been. right? And so you keep doing this over and over again. So one question that immediately comes up here is, does this reward model training procedure really produce a stable proxy for success that we were getting from having a human sitting there saying thumbs up, thumbs down? And like, I think there are tons of questions that a lot of the speakers have already dealt with today, right, about whether even having a single person at the end there going thumbs up, thumbs down is even a stable proxy for success. But let's set that aside for a second. Let's just think about this one particular proxy operation. And so this is the kind of thing that people who are doing AI alignment research worry about all the time, right? Like this plot over here, right? Where there's this possibility that you're going to train your policy starting from where it was originally, and you're going to keep modifying it. This is usually measured by KL divergence from the original policy. And as you move from left to right here, you'll see that you're climbing up on this proxy reward that you have. But at the same time, the actual true reward, which you could think of as some latent utility that users have, is flattening and maybe even starts going down, right? And this is because maybe you're doing something like reward hacking, right, where you identify different aspects of the reward model that you've trained that are very cheap to change. For example, just providing longer and longer answers, where the reward model likes that more and more, but in fact, the human users don't really like that. And so there's a ton of work on over-optimization here, right? So in this project here, when we were looking at asking whether the reward model training procedure is a stable proxy, one thing that we looked at to do a stability analysis was like the very simplest thing that you can do in machine learning, which is to change the random seed, right? And so we changed the random seed in two different places. The first place that we changed it was in training the underlying large language model that we then fine-tuned to become a reward model. So that's the sort of big change. The second thing that you can do is use the same pre-trained large language model and then just change the random seed that you use during fine-tuning, right? And so we did this for two different tasks. One of them is called TLDR, where you're trying to mimic the way that a Reddit user would provide a TLDR line for their own post on Reddit. The second one is this helpfulness task that was defined by Anthropic, where they have a bunch of different dialogues with an AI assistant. And they have two different responses for each of those, for those prompts to an AI assistant, and then they sort of provide you with the human prefers this one over that one kind of data set. Okay. And so what we did was we trained some reward models in TLDR and helpfulness at different sizes, right? We found that their performance in terms of predicting pairwise preferences were about the same. But once we started looking at how they actually ranked different outputs from the same model, right, we saw that there was actually pretty substantial disagreement in terms of, if you were to look at that base generating model and generate up to 64 candidates, right, the agreement in terms of whether they agreed on what the best generation was goes down pretty precipitously. And in fact, if you make this small perturbation, right, that already goes down pretty far. But if you make the big perturbation, there's an even larger discrepancy between these different models. Right, so even just the random seed already changes the view of the reward that you're getting from these models. And then if you then use these models in one of these RLHF pipelines, what you find is that the rank correlation between different outputs that are coming out of the model as you continue to iterate and change the model also keeps dropping, right? So this means that the models are getting more and more divergent in terms of the way that they're ranking outputs that are coming from the model. And so if you then look at a sort of third-party model to assess whether this RLHF procedure is actually improving the outputs that are coming from your model, what you find is that, right, if you just look at a single one of these reward models, which is more or less the standard way that people operate, right, it's very clear that you get this reward hacking behavior that we were talking about before, right? Like you're improving, but then eventually the model's actually getting worse according to your sort of third-party evaluator, right? And one thing that's nice here is that, well, we did identify this form of instability, and in fact, if you do some aggregation across those different models that were disagreeing with each other, you can get some improvement, especially if you do some aggregation across some of those models that were perturbed in the big way. But that said, they don't actually solve all the problems. I'm out of time now, but there are a couple of different things that we looked at. For example, we looked at whether the generating model was copying a lot of the original prompt into the summary, We looked at the output length. And then in the helpfulness case, where we were looking at a human assistant, we also looked at how often the model decided to respond with a bulleted list, because it turns out that a lot of large language models think that if you provide a bulleted list, the person's going to think that it's more helpful. Right? And in these cases, what we found was that doing this aggregation helped a little bit, but often even the aggregation would sort of agree that these different reward hacking behaviors were good ideas. So my takeaways here are, that predictability and computability are, again, sort of some of the keys to success in ML and AI, but a lot of the hardest problems still remain stably defining success. And I think what we did here was the sort of minimal stability assessment that you can do in RLHF, right? And there's just so much more to do here. And this alignment topic here is a very active and rich research area, I think, especially for people who are statistically minded and who think a lot about doing studies with human feedback. So that's all, and thanks so much.
So we do have a few more minutes for questions.
So I'm wondering, great talk, by the way. I'm wondering how you think about, as models get bigger and bigger, these analyses get a lot harder to do, right? Especially for people who don't work at the place you work at.
Yes.
Right? So how do you think about that general problem of, having the world be able to understand the stability of big models in the same way that you can?
Yeah, I think that is a really great question. And yeah, one of the things that makes this particularly difficult question in terms of I guess there's some interacting issues here, right? One of them is that what we've seen is that there appear to be qualitatively different behaviors in these models as they get larger and larger. And so in some sense, it seems like it's necessary in order to make a commentary about the models that are going to be the most used, right, to be able to do research at scale. But on the other hand, yeah, it's just extremely expensive to do that research, to the point that even people inside of Google who were used to sort of thinking about computation as no object now actually have to do some computational budget calculations when they do their experiments. So I think one potential answer here is that models are actually getting more efficient, and we're able to see some of the useful behaviors coming out of these models at smaller scales now. And so it is becoming more feasible to do this kind of research outside of the giant companies. The other thing is that there's, I think, a very interesting subfield that's developing right now on scaling laws that looks at how we can extrapolate across different model scales for the kinds of conclusions that we might try to draw. And setting up those scaling laws in the right way is a very challenging problem. My colleague in the Cambridge office, Ben Adlam, is doing a lot of great work here. But it is a really difficult problem, and thinking about how conclusions from small models can then be applied to large models. I think it's an open problem for sure.
We certainly have time for another question before the next session.
Well, when I work in precision medicine and dealing with rare diseases, most of our data sets are really small number of patients. And we love to do all of this work, but it's there. Of course, we don't have Google big data sets, and just wondering what other avenues we should be thinking of and doing the right thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there is, there's a possibility that the large sort of foundation models that are being developed right now can actually help people who are using smaller models by providing some nice, essentially priors, or constraining the sets of models that you might be able to fit with smaller data. So there have been some interesting cases where using a larger model and then either fine-tuning it, so using some sort of representation or intermediate representation of the data that comes from that model, can provide some gains. So for example, one of the projects that we worked on was looking at chest X-ray data. And we used a very large quantity of chest X-ray data from a large number of different facilities that were collected for a large number of different reasons, and built an underlying foundation model. Those could then be used to build a vector representation for new chest X-ray data. And one thing that we showed was that if you built models on top of those vector representations, they would actually be very useful for predicting different, say, conditions from chest X-ray data using relatively small data sets from like particular areas. So I think there is some possibility here of essentially building data pre-processing tools using the giant data and then being able to do small data studies on top of that. But this is again, I think, a difficult question. And one thing that I think has sort of driven some of the like very compute intensive approaches toward those areas where we have the most data that's just incredibly readily accessible.
All right, let's thank our speaker again and all of our speakers.